Hey friends, this is Mark Suroviec, host of the Workplace Solutions podcast, inviting you to discover the joy of work. All right, how you doing today, Iggy?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad we were able to get together. I was rushing over here from a client meeting to get on the Zoom call with you, and so thank you for being patient and knowing that I forgot to put the link on.
Well, I found it. You actually sent it. I found it after panically telling you I don't have it. So we're both in fine form right now. We're both doing perfect.
We will get this episode together.
Oh, it's going to be epic. Yeah.
Very quick. It's going to be great. I am here today with Iggy Perillo, who is the boss and founder of WSL Leadership. And Iggy cultivates leaders who are building the habit of emotionally intelligent leadership so they can shift culture and make the world a better place. So I love that. I'm not going to say anything more about you. So you introduce yourself, tell us who you are and what WSL Leadership is.
The intro is perfect and to the point. I'm an entrepreneur and I help leaders create thriving teams by really relying on and using their emotional intelligence. And we see a lot of examples of not so thriving teams out there and not so awesome environments and not so awesome workplaces. So I help leaders, I give them tools, techniques to be wise leaders. My background is education and experiential education. So I view myself as a leadership educator, which can look like courses, classes, masterminds, coaching. Like there's all these different little pieces, but my goal is to give people who may or may not consider themselves leaders those tools and expertise to be wise. The WSL of WSL Leadership stands for work, sport, and life. So those are the different views I look at where people can be leaders. You may have an official title as a leader. I love working with athletes. Or you may just be leading your life. And you could be doing that with emotional intelligence that makes things around you flow more smoothly, helps you live a more broad and fulfilled life, and create these teams, but it might be your family team, your neighborhood team, your workplace team. We're always interacting with other people. So I want those relationships to thrive.
So Iggy and I met, what was it, at the unconference? What's the unconference actually called? The National...
NCCPS, like the National Challenge Course Practitioners Symposium.
Yes. So shout out to Tom Leahy. Tom, if you're listening, thanks for helping connect Iggy and I. That's a fun event for folks that do the experiential learning thing. Love open space. We'll have to have an open space conversation at some point, but that's not today. So Iggy, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to talk about dealing with difficult people. I don't know if this has ever happened to you. Have you ever, anyone in the world ever encountered a difficult person? So working with difficult people, specifically, what can I do about challenging personalities at work? How to best deal with just garbage behavior in other people? And what does an emotionally intelligent conflict look like? So those are sort of the three channels we'll explore a little bit along through our conversation today.
Love it. So before we get into the content, we like to do a warm-up activity. Do you have a different word for icebreaker? What do you call it?
I heard it recently called an ice thaw-er. A thawing activity.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Like something like I think it was like a play on warm-up, but they didn't want to say warm-up, so they're like, yeah, we're gonna thaw everyone. I'm like, that assumes I came in like a frozen brick. I don't know. Yeah. I don't have a great alternative. Warm-up is good. Whatever.
My quest continues. My quest for the word. Okay, I have a fun deck here. This is number 57 from the deck. A time I very clearly witnessed a criminal activity.
I'm glad I didn't say very clearly committed a criminal activity.
No. We are not sharing that on the podcast.
No, because no one ever does anything like that. Do you have an answer to this? Because if you have an answer, you should go, because something will come to me.
I do, and if I need to pick a new question from the deck, that's fine too. So I was in grad school at Springfield College, living in the on-campus housing there, and I was on the phone with a friend of mine, and I heard this crash, and I look out the window of my apartment, and I see this guy jump out of his car and start running down the street. And then I see the police running past him and tackle him. So it turns out he had stolen a car in the neighborhood. The police were en route and it was all snowy. And so he slid in the snow trying to evade the police and crashed the stolen car into one of my neighbor's cars. And so I watched the police tackle him and put him into custody. But that was, I just couldn't be like, that's a stolen car. It was very memorable in the moment.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I definitely have stories similar where I've seen people being arrested, but I'm trying to think of a time when I saw the criminal activity happening, right? Which is what your question is. It's like a little deeper, a little messier. I mean, I've seen people speeding all the time. Technically, speeding, is that criminal? Whatever, you get a ticket. I don't know. That seems like weak to say, like, well, I've seen people go fast on the highway. Nah. I saw, okay, here's a better one. I was waiting for a train had stopped all the traffic, so I couldn't get through the intersection and move on. Someone drove up on the sidewalk beside me and passed all the cars waiting for the train and then turned the other direction at the intersection to sort of get someplace else. So pretty clearly they were on the sidewalk and it was wide enough for their car. But I just remember we had been sitting waiting for the train for a while, at the freight train. So we're like, okay, this is, blah, blah, blah. It was, clearly criminal to drive across the sidewalk. So that's the best I can do, I think, at this point.
That's fair.
Thematic. So thanks for inspiring that memory.
Love it. So we're dealing with difficult people, but before we talk about the content, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get to where you are now?
How far back do we want to go? 1,000,000 years ago, I worked for, not even 1,000,000 years ago, actually 2. I had spent and still am working for the Outward Bound schools here in the U.S. So I spent a lot of time for 20 years, basically leading expeditions in the field where I helped. And the purpose of Outward Bound expedition, so a bunch of strangers come together, go on a trip out in the woods. And for me, it was northern Minnesota, so we canoed and backpacked in the Boundary Waters. The purpose is to build leadership, character, and service. So I spent a lot of time, strangers thrown together, for them, for very novel environment, very unfamiliar territory, and help them develop leadership and their leadership skills. So eventually, I moved to supporting staff and not being in the field as much, and then was in the field less, and then, kind of moved through different layers within the organization. And at one point, I'm like, I could do this for myself and work with whoever I want, doing it in the way that works for me. And I love expedition. I love being on expedition because it's super tangible, right? Like either we get our team from here to there, or we don't. Like where you can tell where we are. Like we know what's happening. We know, we get there or not. I created my business then to support leaders in that same transformational development that happened. I mean, that's, I guess, how I got here. And here I am, surprised. Like organizationally, I work with individuals, but also I've worked with full corporate environments and working with sub-teams or different parts of helping them facilitate how they lead or how they interact or how they want to deal with conflict within their organization. So it's a mix of what I have ended up doing, but that theme of developing leaders and developing at the time, we didn't even have the word emotionally intelligent, but later you're like, you need to relate well to your teammates. That's emotional intelligence. They got labels later after I'd been doing them for 15 years. I'm like, this is what you mean, that you can communicate well, that you can regulate your emotions, that you can, do these different pieces. So that brought me to, I guess, where I am now.
Nice. And just as a reminder, if you are a regular podcast listener, you can go back and listen to the episode on self-awareness that Dr. Chris Auger and I had, which I'm sure there'll be some overlap between that episode and our conversation today. All right, let's deal with some difficult people. So let's define that phrase or challenging personality or whatever way you like to communicate that. What does that mean?
I think the first swipe at what that means is anyone doing something I don't like is one way to look at that. But then also there's this subtle part that's anyone doing something in a way I don't like. So it's a little more subtle. Like they're doing something, but I don't like how they're doing it. Like they do something I don't like, or they do something in a way I don't like, or what we find difficult or challenging about personalities. If you're in a leadership role, you're like, I want this thing to get done. It doesn't get done. There's some obvious examples of something getting done or not getting done, or being on time or not on time, those types of pieces. But I think the other pieces are around how people communicate sometimes. We feel like, that person is always yelling at me. When if you ask that person they might say, I'm really enthusiastic. I love blah, blah, blah people. I'm just really loud. Or that personality rubs me the wrong way. That's just how they interact, how they move through the world doesn't suit you for whatever reason. If you're really an extrovert, they're really introverted, you might be like, why don't you, come out of your shell, blah, blah. We try and make people act more like ourselves in some ways, or we want to see ourselves reflected in other people. So that, I think, can lead to some of those ideas around how we define a challenging personality or a difficult person. But the reality is it's behavior.
And so what I'm hearing in how you mentioned that was sometimes it's difficult to even quantify what is it about what they're doing. I think I heard you say it's rubbing me the wrong way, which is super vague, but you feel that, you experience that as a result of their behavior.
Yeah. It's not always obvious or clear what that thing is, but we find it challenging or we find it difficult for different reasons.
So our big question of the first half of this episode is, what can I do about it? What can I do about challenging personalities? And we're going to focus most of our conversation around work, and we believe in integrating the whole life. So if you want to feel free to use examples that relate to family or outside of work context. That's fine. Our focus is about challenging personalities at work.
We might as well limit it to something, because I think we come across challenging personalities in many places. And work as a context makes it easier because theoretically you have agreed upon goals with your work, right? Like we know what we're doing here. We're at a restaurant, we want to serve food to people. We're at a company making widgets, we want to generate enough widgets. Like whatever it is, like there's work gives us this context of a shared goal. So what can you do about these challenged personalities? One is to revisit that shared goal. What are we actually even here for? I think we hear and sometimes see organizations that the popular term is siloed, like one department, the marketing department doesn't talk to the production department, that doesn't talk to the leadership team, that doesn't talk to the people on the ground doing the manufacturing work, for example. So all these different places, different divisions, different sectors, different silos can feel like competitive with other aspects of the business. I think I've seen places where resources seem scarce, so everyone wants their department to have the resources or their project or their thing, and then other places they don't, right? So this is just the context of what causes these challenges to rise up. Scarce resources, a view of I need to be seen well in order to progress or move up sometimes. So we see that sometimes in personalities. Someone was recently telling me, I'm not a lawyer, but about how at their law firm, when the new lawyers would start in or the new folks there, it's really collegial. They support each other. They're all growing and developing. They're really helping each other out. Then they realize only so many can make partner. Suddenly they're stabbing each other in the back, cutthroat activities to try and make themselves look good so they can make partner, because only so many can. There's this very sharp funnel. And I'd say that's true in many organizations where there's a very sharp point to how many managers get promoted, how many VPs there are, how many presidents, how many CEOs, how many executives are there even within this organization. If people want to move up through this sort of hierarchical chain, there's fewer and fewer spaces to fill, which means more and more competition sometimes in some mindsets.
Yeah, I've seen that if you've ever done team building or leadership programming with folks that might be in a sales role where their compensation is based on what they're bringing in. It's like there's in many ways incentive to withhold that information, even though if everyone gets better at it, then the organization gets better, and the rising water levels, or not levels all ships, rising whatever that.
Rising tide raises all boats.
That one.
You got it. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. That's a great example of where if I'm good at sales, that serves me well. But if I don't share that knowledge with you, that still serves me well, but that might hinder our overall organization. We might not all get better at sales because I get a commission. I want all the commissions, or I want the bonus or the recognition, whatever it is that comes with that. So this is just a big way of describing what we mean by challenging people. Then what do you do about it, right? So, cool. There's backstabbing. There's withholding information. There's just distrust. I think a lot of the challenging personalities at work are wrapped up in this sort of negative culture of how these personalities interact with each other in this environment. If we're working for ourselves, it's great. The only challenging personality is ourselves. So that's a different story for a different time. But if we're working with other people, how do we create a culture where all these personalities can thrive and do their best is part of it, but also how do we work together in this organization? So there's different levels of where this challenge might come out. And I love to just summarize it down to what is the actual challenging behavior that I'm seeing? Is that behavior that someone steals your lunch out of the community kitchen every day? Like that's a specific behavior, right? And it's easy to say like, I work with a bunch of animals who are thieves and like cool, but the reality is it's the behavior. Or someone was telling me about how their boss, whenever they write an email, wrote it in all caps every time, and they're like, are they yelling at me? Are they so mad? What's happening? Do they hate me? Because it was just all caps. Versus I think the reality was the boss was just, I'm trying to be enthusiastic, right? So like this weird communication breakdown. versus all caps. Everyone who read it thought that they were being screamed at. But that's a behavior, right? This email was in all caps. Specific thing that happened. It's observable. We can observe behavior. And once we nail down what that behavior actually is, and people have these sort of behaviors we want to see that we don't see, so it gets a little messy. So in that sales environment, maybe we want to see shared knowledge, but it's just not happening, right? We want to see a shared tactic. I don't know what you say, really, like a shared method for getting more sales. It'd be awesome if that was shared among all the salespeople to help our organization have more sales, and it's amazing. So we want to see some things, but instead we see these sort of activities of distrust where I don't share my information. I need to not put my voice out there. There's this whole concept of psychological safety that Amy Edmondson developed. So we see the opposite of psychological safety, in my mind, is activities of distrust. Not just like, oh, I don't trust people, this is weird, but we actively do things that show our mistrust, not sharing, not putting ourselves out there, not offering anything to the organization. And it can look like also sort of the doing the bare minimum, the people that just sort of, are clocked in to clock in and do as little as they can because they're not invested. We see this lack of investment, lack of buy-in, lack of inspiration, lack of creativity. A lot of things shrink down, but the behavior we actually see is the thing that we need to address as the challenging behavior, not the lack of things. We know these are happening. Like we know it could be more creative. It could be more spontaneous. It could be more driven. It could be more motivation, whatever it is. Cool. What are we actually seeing that's the problem? And so those challenging personalities are often models of the behavior we don't want. And so identifying the behavior and who and where these behaviors happen is a really important first step. Have you seen some of that happen in your experience with people?
We'll just say yes.
Okay. Good. I'm not alone. You're not alone, but yeah.
In case I forget to say it later, please feel free to share stories that you use in your training or with your clients. Obviously, please remove whatever pertinent details, but we love stories on the podcast. Help bring some of those things to life as you're sharing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have some challenging personality. We have some challenging behaviors, right? And whether that personality is something that just rubs me the wrong way, what's that behavior that rubs me the wrong way? Is it too much eye contact? I feel like they're staring at me. Is it too little eye contact? I don't feel like they're here with me. Is it that their tone seems really quiet and I actually can't hear what them they speak, and so I always think they're just hiding something? Like, what is it? And what is that behavior separate from my judgment of it? Like, this person makes too much eye contact, they're angry at me. Like, the they're angry at me is the judgment, right? But the thing I can see is, to me, a lot of eye contact. Like, they make eye contact constantly. Okay, great. We're going to talk more about how to deal with behaviors a little bit, but there's a lot around how people are reacting to other things in their environment, and I don't like it. Every time, 5 o'clock hits, they drop everything and sprint out the door. No one says bye. They're just out of here. Whatever it is. Like, these things that, what are the behaviors? So I'm looking at behaviors. I'm looking at why they happen a little bit. And I think we're going to sort of bleed into the next part a little bit. What do you do about it? Recognize it and understand that it's a behavior specifically. We can work to change behavior. We really can't change people. I know you've seen this. Like, we can give people opportunities to explore and try new behavior patterns, try new speaking patterns, try new everything. But the reality is I can't, motivate other people is sort of this weird myth, right? I can't motivate you. I can encourage you. I can incentivize you. If I was really sort of archaic, I could punish you for doing the wrong thing, but I can't actually change who you are as a person. I can try to change and shape your behavior in ways that I think more support our team, more support our goals, right? So we have these challenging behaviors, maybe revisiting these goals. By the way, we're all on the same team. Is this really, I had a boss once who was mentioned about how within his family, when he would argue with his wife about whatever they want to do, at one point, one of them would be like, hey, we're on the same team, just to remind them that they're a unit together, trying to make decisions and do things together. There's this sort of, I don't know if it's like a view of like mission retreats, mission development retreats would seem like silly fluff. But the reality is those mission development retreats and those visioning retreats and those goal setting and those mission statements, if they're not real and they don't capture what we're all doing together, like, they're useless. And there's a reason to revisit them, because you probably have teams turn over, people come, people go, whatever. They sign up, they see, oh, our mission is to support people in need. Great, whatever, who cares? And so they're not saying that they're not bought in, but they don't understand it at a personal human level. So revisiting those mission, vision, values things, I think can be a super helpful piece to helping people understand why this challenging behavior is happening. Is it just not aligned with our values, or is it something else?
It reminds me when you have one of those mission and vision events, the people that go into it, so much of the value is experiencing that, is digging into that together, is that we're all trying to figure this out and it's important. And folks that enter the team later did not experience that. And so to the folks that were there, it's this vivid thing. It's this catalytic thing. And it's like, yeah, but those people weren't there. It's a different level of buy-in.
Yeah, the process is part of it. Those events, like the reason you have them at an event or an offsite often is to create that sense of unique memory, like you're building a unique memory for a new place, new thing, but also to build that powerful connections that happen there, for sure. Something
you said earlier made me think of Brené Brown when she says the story I told myself.
Oh yeah, I love Brené Brown.
Yeah, big fans of Brené Brown. Got to see her speak live once, and that was awesome. Can you speak to that idea?
The Brené Brown, this researcher, for folks that may, for some reason, have not heard of her, we're obviously big fans, but she is a social worker researcher and does research on how people build connection and how we work as humans in a lot of ways. Human connection is one of her big themes, as well as how we express emotions to build connection and how we operate in the world. I can't remember her exact way she said it. She's so eloquent also. She's a researcher and storyteller. But she would say that the thing that happens is great, but then there's the story I tell myself about the thing that happens. You need to separate those at a certain point. Like, am I saying, oh, Mark was really angry with me today? Or am I saying, wow, Mark, I don't know, hit my desk with his hand, like it slapped it as he walked by. These are different things, right? Like I can see this behavior. He slapped my desk as he walked by. Or, oh my gosh, he's angry. I'm going to get yelled at, whatever. There's a lot of story we tell ourselves when we see behavior. And with challenging personalities, we explode that out. We're like, oh my gosh, this person is such a jerk. I can't believe they never want to talk to me, when in reality, are they a jerk? Are they just busy? Do they have something else going on? What do you mean they never want to talk to you? We tell ourselves we get ourselves really hyped up with stories sometimes.
Yeah.
And these are the stories we tell ourselves. This is not the story we learn from the other person. We see behavior, we create stories.
And if the fundamental attribution error is true, then we attribute that to their character and their personhood, not not situational. So
absolutely. I love the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, because she talks about fixed growth mindsets. Are you familiar? You nod like you're familiar, right? But she talks about how some things we take on as part of our identity, and some things we can separate from ourselves and be like, oh, that's just a thing I do over here. When we take something on as a part of our identity, we are really protective of that, and we get really weird around it in different ways. I know people say they're like, I'm not a math person, right? I feel like I've heard this, or I don't do public math, which is a very funny way of saying I don't want to figure out the tip for this, group dinner in an awesome way. And so people are taking that as their identity. Well, I'm not a math person. I'm a, whatever. I'm a languages person. I'm a music person. I'm a group activity person. I'm not a solo alone time person. We tell ourselves these stories and then we defend them, but they're all stories we're telling ourselves. Like we then make that up to be our identity and who we are and how we are seen in the world. And then we act to protect that identity through behavior that doesn't actually meet our needs in different ways. Like, I'm not a math person. I can have no numbers in my world around me. I'm like, what, do you not have a phone? Like, what? I don't know. How do you operate? Like this, you're getting weird now. Things get weird pretty quickly because we get overly attached to the stories we tell ourselves. And this is just about ourselves, right? So translate that out to other people. Like, oh, they're such a blah, blah, blah. We suddenly have names and labels, and they're a jerk versus they're acting like a jerk is really a significant difference.
Do you see that as one of the big aha moments when you're doing a conflict workshop of that understanding, like separating those two? Is that...
Yeah. I think identifying behavior is like an idea that people hadn't really thought of, or something they have been working so hard with the story that they're telling themselves, that to go back and look at the behavior, the actual behavior as itself, as its own thing, as its own entity, is clarifying a lot of times for people. Oh, you're telling yourself that you have an angry coworker that's always bitter and doesn't want to be there. But the reality you learn later is that those behaviors were so that they could not make eye contact because it was really bright and they're sensitive to bright lights. So they just didn't make eye contact and looked away, all the time. So it's a very different story and interpretation. So finding the behavior and looking into the behavior, I think, is really clarifying for folks.
They rush out at 5:00 because the daycare closes at 5:30.
Yeah.
And it's a 28-minute drive.
Right. Exactly. You don't know. And you're like, oh, they're such a jerk. They never come to, and there's this sort of other set up for people. I don't have kids, but I know there's a lot of expectation often on folks to do after work in the before times when you had people working together. Oh, we're going to go to happy hour together. We're going to go blah, blah, blah together. We're going to go to do this and socialize with your coworkers. Often there's a lot of pressure to do that. And some folks, often people with kids are like, no, I have to go take care of my kid, my family. Like they could never go. And they're like, oh, who's this jerk that's never part of our team? Well, they have other things in their life. Right. But we tell ourselves a story. Oh, there's this jerk coworker that doesn't care about our team or doesn't want to get to know us as people. And the reality is how you're doing that just doesn't fit with their life.
Good stuff. All right. So I probably got us off track. Where are we on the agenda?
Who knows?
What do you want to talk about?
Well, I think we start bleeding into, how do I best then deal with this garbage behavior in other people? Mm-hmm. Because if we're separating behavior from our story, there is actually some garbage behavior out there. A person doesn't show up on time. I literally had a coworker who was late several days in a row, and it was frustrating because we're working with a group, and so the group is there. There's not just the two of us hanging out. We had to do stuff. We had an agenda. We have stuff to get done. And so my coworker's late. I need to do something about it. I think me as a younger person, I had a boss, so I'm in this organizational space at the time. And I'm like, hey, boss, coworker's late every day this week. This is really rough on me because I'm left holding the bag a little bit. I'm left kind of doing more work. It doesn't feel fair. There's a lot of stories there, right? Like my coworker's just dumping this all on me. Like, why can't they show up on time? Blah, blah, blah. And my boss, for better or for worse, was like, I think you need to talk to them. Like, okay, thanks, boss. I don't know if you were
But you're the boss. It's your job to fix it.
And yes and no, right? At the time, I was like, oh, okay, fine. Why are you such a weak boss? And the reality is, no, it really should be on me to talk to my coworker. It affects me. The boss is doing the boss thing. So, yeah, I had to have this conversation with my coworker. But because there was a very clear behavior, like you showed up late. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. It's pretty obvious. I came to my coworker and said, hey, you're showing up late every day this week. It's really hard on me. It's not working for me. What's going on? This is not okay for me as a person. If we're going to start at 9:30 instead of 9, maybe I should roll in at 9:30 too. But then does that mean you'd show up at 10? So I don't know. What's going on here? It was good for me to have that conversation with my coworker. And they're like, oh yeah, life gets in the way. I'm like, okay. And we're friends, and my coworker and I were friends. She could have told me more if she was like, oh, something is, whatever is happening. We're at a relationship level where she could have told me more if there was a bigger thing happening. But basically the story that I got from her was life gets in the way sometimes. Like every day this week, life's gotten in the way. Like, I don't know. Maybe there needs to be some life management for us to do these things that people are expecting of us together. So dealing with this garbage behavior, you're late every day. Having a really clear conversation is always a great thing, to have that conversation that you can bring forward. Here's the behavior I'm seeing. Here's why it's not working. And here's how it feels to me. I think are really key parts of that communication that need to happen. If you were just like, why are you such a late jerk all the time? Get it together. That would not have been a great conversation. That would not have gone anywhere, especially with a friend of mine, especially with a coworker that I'm relying on. So opening those conversations, I think, is a great way. And opening those conversations in a way to get information. Like, here's what's going on. Here's what I see. Here's what's happening for me. What's happening for you? What's going on your side? Is a great way to have a actual conversation versus a ranty monologue that doesn't result in a lot of productivity usually.
So I think some principles I'm picking up from what you just shared, you're leveraging the relationship. So in this context, it's not about her breaking the rules or even her task efficiency. This is how this behavior is affecting me as another human being in relationship with you. If you have relationship power to leverage, that's awesome. I'm also hearing that curiosity in trying to understand, which I'm guessing really helps you empathize. If it's a legitimate reason that you didn't know, so you can change your story, it changes that perspective. But I love what you're sharing so far.
Yeah, I think some of it too is being really clear about that this behavior is not helping me as a person have a hard time, but also we have shared goals, right? Back to that shared goals Blabberfest we just had. Like, we together need to do these things. So you sort of being late at your part affects our ability to do the things we need to do together, both. So it's not just, hey, you're affecting me as a person because we have a relationship and we're people, but also you're making it hard for me/us to meet our goals, essentially, in that context.
Okay. Life is way too short for work to suck. So if you want help to build your team, train your team, or manage your team, we're here. Come see us at workplaysolutions.com. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Or
Sure.
And if you're going to come to that later, you can come back to it.
Well,
so.
whatever. We're going wherever we're going. We'll get wherever we're going.
I don't think it aligns, so my apologies.
That's fine. It's all great.